Okay, so you have been controversial apparently throughout your career as a physician. You wrote a book, The Piapi Diet. There's, for whatever reason, controversy around this diet of low sugar, of avoiding sugar. There's somehow controversy around that. You then have controversy around statins and cholesterol, and then around COVID-19. And we're going to tackle all of these. We're going to talk about all of these tonight. But I want to first start off with, because now that, when you read your Wikipedia page, I mean, it must bother you if you ever go and read it and they're like, oh, controversial or conspiracy. They always label people these horrible
Sure.
labels. When you decided you wanted to be a doctor, I mean, what was your point of, did you want to just follow big pharma and the narrative and ensure that you never had these smears against you? I mean, why did you become a doctor?
Well, I mean, on a personal level, I mean, I grew up in a medical family. Both my parents were general practitioners, so there was definitely some influence there. But for me, I specialized in cardiology. I had an interest in the heart. Again, partly inspired by the death of my older brother when I was 11. He was 13. He got actually viral myocarditis and went into crashing heart failure within a week, actually, just a tummy bug. So there was all of those little elements that played in. But of course, then when you go through what you call high school in the US, I was interested in the science subjects. I was interested in human beings. I was interested in psychology. I had all these different varied interests, and I ended up doing cardiology. And for me as a doctor, certainly, I was always someone who, in fact, to be honest, even as a um, as a young adult, as a kid. And the way I was brought up is that I would always had a very strong sense of ethics and values and fighting injustice, and I got that from my father. So, I probably took that with me into my job. And two reasons why I went down this path of becoming so-called controversial. One is to try and understand actually why we hadn't curbed heart disease in the way that it was predicted in the late 90s when Nobel Prize winners Brown and Goldstein suggested that by the early 2000s may see the end of heart disease because they had discovered the cholesterol LDL receptor. And there was a thinking at the time that if these drugs that were being developed, including statins, were mass prescribed, then you would get people's cholesterol so low that you would never see heart disease. But that all failed. And I qualified in 2001 from medical school, and by 2010, I could see that one, we hadn't really curbed heart disease or made much inroads other than having initially tackled tobacco, which had a big impact from the 80s, 1980s onwards. But that had stalled, and we had this whole increasing chronic disease epidemic, and I could feel it in the system, strain in the system as a practicing doctor. So I went down a path to try and look at the cause of heart disease. And of course, when you are coming up with theories or you are presenting evidence that is contrary to the conventional wisdom, then you're naturally going to get pushback. But most of that pushback was really coming from those powerful vested interests that profited from misleading, flawed information. So I took that on, through medical journals, through writing, through being asked to go in mainstream media to discuss it. And that's when you get all the pushback. And that's something that, one of the lessons of public health advocacy is as soon as your work threatens an industry or an ideological cabal, you will be attacked, sometimes relentlessly
Hmm.
and viciously. And so you have to grow a rhinoceros hide, Kim. You have to have a thick skin.
Yeah.
So that's probably part of the reason that I've been called controversial. But I was also the person in the UK to really drive the campaign behind a sugary drinks tax, or what you call a soda tax in the US. And I was successful in that. And when I started speaking about sugar being harmful in the BMJ in 2013, I started getting called a quack. And of course, all these people and that were really coming for me were people who were linked to the sugar industry or the food industry. So coming back to Wikipedia, when you look at how big corporations exert their power and suppress democracy and are the big contributors to the chronic disease pandemic, one of the tactics is what we call opposition fragmentation. So they smear people who are
Hmm.
essentially calling them out for their misdemeanors, and they can even do that through Google, through Wikipedia. So Wikipedia has a lot of merits, but unfortunately, it is also under big commercial influence as well.
Yeah. So when you
I
when you
hope
started
that answers your question briefly.
Yeah, no, it definitely did. So which one did you start off with being controversial? What was because it's three things that I can gather. Sugar, which is so insane to me that that's a controversial perspective to say sugar's harmful. I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like
Well,
everybody knows that now.
they do now, but at the time when I was speaking about it, it was very controversial. But quite quickly, yeah. I mean, this is how things evolve over time. In the same way that we'll come onto it later. People who are sounding the alarm about the COVID vaccine are
Right.
being called quacks or whatever conspiracy theorists. I can guarantee you, without any shadow of a doubt, and hopefully sooner rather than later, that most people will realize it was a complete and total disaster.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah.
did you
So
start off
so
with, was the statins that you started off with where they were like, okay, this guy's now controversial, or was it sugar? Which one came first?
Well, they were actually linked. They were actually linked. So I wrote an article in the BMJ in 2013 called "Saturated Fat is Not the Major Issue," and the heart of the article, Kim, was to try and put together a completely new narrative on heart disease. And I had to put the jigsaw together to really pull together the issue around the primary management or in the prevention of heart disease. The primary focus had been lowering cholesterol, which had driven a whole low-fat diet movement, which
Right.
had then been exploited by the food industry, who had marketed low-fat foods that are high in sugar, right, and refined carbohydrates, which actually were increasing obesity and type 2 diabetes. But all of this was based upon a flawed hypothesis of lowering cholesterol, predominantly through the use of statin drugs. So I had to break down all that data and basically say this was the wrong approach. It was heavily flawed, and we were missing the root cause of heart disease, which essentially is, at the top of the hierarchy of causes, something called insulin resistance, which is exacerbated from dietary, ultra-processed foods, refined carbs, and sugar. So that's really how things started. But I have to put the jigsaw together to say, well, if cholesterol, if lowering cholesterol has been misguided, then I had to present the data to explain why lowering cholesterol through food had no impact on heart disease. And that's what the data told us. And if we move on from that, then actually we're talking about a drug called statin drugs, which is a $1 trillion industry, one of the most lucrative prescribed drugs in the history of medicine. One estimate suggested that 1 billion people are prescribed statins worldwide.
Yeah.
And their benefits are so marginal that most people don't benefit from them. And they're not told that by their doctor. And one of the reasons they're not told that by their doctor is the doctors don't understand the evidence. And I would put it, and then they don't, even if they do, they don't communicate the evidence in a way that patients can understand in keeping with ethical evidence-based medical practice and informed consent. And really, that's what I've been trying to advocate for. And the reason why there's pushback on that, Kim, is if most people are told that, for example, taking a statin gives them a 1% benefit at best over 5 years in preventing a heart attack, most of those patients would choose not to take the drug.
Right.
And if that was to happen across medicine through, informed consent, then that would be a huge hit on the drug industry that profits from deception.
Yeah.
And that's really their business. Their business model is fraud. And really, that's at the heart of what I've been doing for about a decade, both with taking on or exposing big pharma's manipulations, but you can apply it to big food as well.
Yeah. And so you started that, did you say back in 2010 or 2013 is when you really started taking this on?
Yeah, actually, the first time I hit the mainstream media in the UK was when I wrote an article in February 2011 in the Observer newspaper, which, as you know, is part of the Guardian group and very high impact and influence. And they put it as a front page commentary, and it was called "I Mend Hearts. Then I see our hospitals serve junk food to my patients." And really, in the middle of this whole obesity epidemic that has been discussed, ever since World Health Organization 2004 said that there was a global issue, we haven't made any serious inroads. And by 2011, I said, well, we should at least start in our own backyard. Why are hospitals a branding opportunity for the junk food industry? Why are we serving our patients junk food? Why is 75% of the food purchased in hospitals junk food? So if we are going to make inroads, then the medical profession needs to really, play a role of setting an example. And that's where I started my initial sort of campaigning into the mainstream. I got Jamie Oliver, you may know, who's a celebrity chef in the UK, to support that campaign that I started. I lobbied the British Medical Association to make it part of their policy that junk food should not be sold in hospitals. medical oncologist. So I did a lot of work also with those organizations and worked as an ambassador for many of those organizations in these various roles as well. So I'm not just somebody who's just an outlier who's making noise. I also believe in the power of dialogue and to try and influence those organizations that can have an impact on doctors' practice. But these campaigns take a long time and they need to be sustained.
Yeah.
And really, in many ways, I'm kind of, almost a one-man band at the moment, because you see what happens with all of this, Kim, is when you do speak out, you will get pushback, you will get threats on your career. And unfortunately, there aren't that many people, I think it's growing, who are willing to speak out. And the medical profession, as you know, is very hierarchical and obedient.
Yeah.
There aren't enough doctors, I think, that should be speaking out courageously on behalf of their patients. They unfortunately often will turn silent or turn a blind eye to misdemeanors going on in medicine.
So it's interesting that you've been tackling this for a long time. I mean, a lot of us woke up during the pandemic to the corruption inside of the medical industry. I mean, I think we all kind of knew yeah, I grew up knowing and being taught, when you look at a study and they say this is good for you, look at who funded the study, right? So we were kind of taught these basics of make sure Big Sugar didn't fund the study that says sugar's good for you, right? Or Big
Yeah.
Potato says, or whatever, right? So I think there was some awareness to that, but there wasn't awareness, I think, until the pandemic, or widespread awareness of like just funding in the medical institutions at the university level, even, of these organizations that are supposed to be for our health, and that they have such big connections to pharmaceutical industries that want to push medicines on us. And I think a lot of us have wondered throughout our life. We see it all the time in social media. We see it all the time with people when they're just chatting about saying, why aren't doctors focused on healthy lifestyle? Why aren't doctors talking to us about, it's like you go to the doctor and all they do is prescribe you a bunch of medications, rather than
Yeah.
really telling you, like, this is what you need to do. Like, you need to lose weight. Maybe they might mention it, but then they'll prescribe you something at the same time for whatever condition it is. And I think a lot of us have been
Yeah.
very frustrated with the medical industry in that lack
Yeah.
of, you're my doctor, you're supposed to help me get healthy and be healthy, not
Yeah.
just be a mouthpiece for big pharma and basically do their bidding and make them a bunch of money. So the pandemic, I think, opened a lot of people's eyes to this level, to the level. And I think now more and more people are questioning almost everything. I mean, for me, I never questioned vaccines ever. I just, if the doctor said you needed a vaccine, I pretty much just took it. If I felt like I really needed it. But when it came to COVID, suddenly I questioned that. And then I started questioning all of them. Now I'm like, well, I should probably research everything that the doctor tells me to do rather than just take
Sure.
it at face value. But you've been doing this since 2010, 2011. That's a long time. And you're approaching 15 years. I mean, 15 years
Yeah.
of challenging the system. Many of us have only been talking about it for 4. So you were up. I mean, did you feel the pressure? I mean, like I said, many of us are aware now of the big pharma pressure, the campaigns, the smear campaigns, but you experienced this early on. So I mean, were you shocked by that? Were people believing you that there was this pressure against you when you were talking about cholesterol and statins and sugar?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was publicized as well, Kim, so people were very well aware of it. When the statin controversy started in 2013 in the BMJ, with an article I wrote about saturated fat, I'd also said that we had overprescribed statin to millions of people, and the side effect rate was much higher than what we were being told by the establishment, in the sense that, probably 1 in 5 people get some sort of side effect that interferes with their quality of life, which essentially is unacceptable. And the person who was behind, one of the lead statin researchers in the world, in Oxford University, basically went for myself and a doctor from Harvard called John Abramson, who in a separate article had referenced and said the same thing that I had, and basically tried to get those articles retracted, saying that what we had done would cause tremendous damage to British medicine because people would stop their statins and people would die. So these are the kind of tactics that really, big pharma fuels.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, what happened was, because of this, these calls for retraction, it got publicized in the Guardian, front page of the Guardian. A few months later, BBC picked it up, then the editor of the British Medical Journal was put under so much pressure that she sent the articles for an independent review of whether they should be retracted. And of course, at that stage, I was still a junior doctor. I was a junior cardiologist. But these sorts of things can be career destroying. But, luckily, but actually, I would think based upon the evidence that was presented by to the independent panel, they ruled 6-0 in our favor. There was no reason for retraction. There was a caveat, a correction, or whatever else. But that was it. So I got a bit of a taste at that point, because that would have, that effectively would have been the end of my career. But that actually fueled me, if anything else, Kim, because I got very suspicious, but because of the backlash was so huge, something else was going on. So I kept pushing for, the informed consent issue, et cetera, kept publishing more articles on statins. And the battle carried on for years. And then in 2019, a front page article appeared in the Mail on Sunday, a front page story that targeted myself and two other scientists, one of them a general practitioner, basically saying that we were statin deniers, we were dangerous. And the editorial written by the health editor of the Mail on Sunday basically said, "A place belongs in hell for those that say statins don't work." And there were pictures of myself and two other people in that. And actually, as a result of that, Kim, not many people know this, but I actually got told by my hospital at the time, about a month later, they didn't say anything about the statin stuff, but they said my services were no longer required. And since that time, it has been a struggle, to get, jobs in the NHS, for example. But, interestingly, the Mail on Sunday is now being sued. I didn't get involved in that case. When that piece came out, it was only a few months after my mother died, and that became a national story because I wrote about, failures in the NHS at that point. And I decided that it wasn't worth, my while to get involved in a defamation case. But actually, that is at the moment waiting for a ruling. And I would not be surprised that the judge rules in the favor of my two friends and colleagues who were defamed in the article. So this is the kind of stuff you gotta have a thick skin for. But ultimately, for me, my duty and obligation is to patients, to scientific integrity. And if I see anything that is harming my patients, it's my duty to speak out. And unfortunately, the system is harming patients, and I am in a position and have a platform to keep speaking out, and I'll keep doing that.